Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Karen Treisman to the show. Karen, great to have you on.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. And hello to everyone listening.
Super excited to have you on. And we always start, Karen, by getting guests to introduce themselves to the Sports Psych Show audience. So if we could start there, I'd be most grateful.
So obviously my name's Karen. I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialise in working with trauma. And when I say that, I mean relational and developmental trauma, cultural, intergenerational, organisational. Lots of my background's been working in sort of child protection, fostering, adoption, asylum seeking and refugee young people. And then I shifted more to being an organisational consultant as well. So I support 90 organisations currently on their journey to become more trauma, adversity and culturally informed, infused and responsive. Do lots of training. So I've got my own organisation, Safe Hands and Thinking Minds. And I'm an author of 10 books, 5 sets of therapeutic cards and 5 cuddly toys. I think that's enough for now.
And you are the first person. Actually, no, the second person to come on with an MBE. You are a member of the British Empire.
I am. Yes, I left that bit out. I am. Yes, very surreal, but
When did that? That's incredible. When did that happen?
happened during the pandemic. So I've actually still
Okay.
not been able to go and get my. I've got my medal, but haven't had the ceremony.
Right.
So happened last year at some point.
Is the ceremony going to happen? Are you going to meet Liz, the Queen, or anybody else from the royal family?
I'm hoping for Liz, but you never know. Yes, the plan is. I actually just got confirmed today. It's in May, so going in a couple of months
Wow.
now. So yeah.
Super exciting.
Yeah.
And look, Karen, I have been a long time follower and admirer of your work. And my understanding would be a lot of the MBE comes as a consequence of your work in the area of child clinical psychology. Your books have made a big impact.
I hope so. Try.
I love the look of your books, the workbooks especially. They're based around different animals and really scaffolding and bringing trauma to life for kids and helping them through difficult times.
Yeah, I try to make them as relational and sensory and trauma informed as possible in how they are. So they're very, I hope, fun, engaging, accessible, user friendly. And so rather than what we often see with books, that's just a lot of black and white text, they've got lots of infographics and eco maps and examples and photos. There's a story, there is arts and craft activities. Then there's lots of worksheets that you can use and ideas how to use them. And then there's an adult section at the end for parents or carers or practitioners as to not just because what often happens with worksheets, I suppose, is people just pick them up and use them. Whereas that section is how do we use them in a quality, not quantity, like meaningful, enriched. Here's some questions you could ask. Here's some creative ways that you can adapt them. Because as we know, it's not what you do, it's often how you do it. Kind of we're our strategy, we're our greatest tool in that way. Yeah.
And the books contain animals such as an octopus, a pug, a giraffe. Is there a giraffe?
There's a giraffe, there's a crocodile, there's a ninja.
A ninja.
Yeah, Neon the ninja, the nightmare ninja. Yes, there's a baboon. They're all based. Each character is after a friend or a family member, really, and all the different characters. Most of them are based in different countries in Africa where I've lived or visited, and they're really to make it more interesting and accessible and fun in essence. So Yeah, and I think, as we know, stories, sometimes it's really hard to talk about things directly because it feels exposing or intolerable or painful or too personal.
Mhm.
So there's something about creating a bit of separating distance, externalizing, a bit like most of us are better at giving other people's advice about relationships or about what's going on at Married at First Sight or Love Island than our own relationships. And so I think stories are quite similar, that often for children, it can help them to talk about anxiety or self esteem or bullying or trauma, but about the character, which allows a little bit of planting the seeds before you then move on and talk about what they might be living through or experiencing.
What age range is it for, Karen?
So, this is a controversial question because I disagreed with the choice. So,
Right.
technically, they are listed for 5 to 10-year-olds, but
Mm.
I kind of really disagree with that. So,
Okay.
the story is for 5 to 10-year-olds, but the activities is literally cradle to grave, womb to tomb. I mean, I use them with teenagers, I use them with adults, I use them with men in prisons through to adults in refugee services. So, I think the story is for younger children, although lots of us like a story, but the tips, the tools, the activities, you can massively adapt in lots of different contexts for lots of different age ranges.
And these books deal with personal concepts and constructs such as anxiety and self-concepts. What else? What other topics?
Yes, so what do I have? I've got Ollie the Octopus on bereavement, grief, death, and loss,
Hmm.
which is particularly, the story is about a mum who dies, but you could actually adapt it around many loss, like in divorce, foster care, various. I've got Presley the Pug, which is about emotional literacy, emotional vocabulary, and emotional regulation, and sort of soothing, grounding, calming ideas. I've got Neon the Ninja, which is about nightmares and sleep difficulties. I've got Binny the Baboon about anxiety, worries, and stress. Jilly the Giraffe about self esteem and strengths. Cleo the Croc about kids who have experienced trauma but who externalize. So it's not for those children who clam up, retreat, or dissociate. It's for those who learn to become sharks in shark infested waters, who have hardened their hearts, who I suppose express it in not trusting others or showing that in anger.
I'm so pleased we've started here because, I mean, we are here to talk about trauma informed organizations, but I wanted to bring you onto the Sports Psych show. This is the Sports Psych show, but we're talking clinical psych, mental health, well-being, trauma, because and I know so many others in the sporting industry, whether they're sports psychologists or coaches, are passionate about, as sports coaches, as we are, we're coaches of people first. We're coaches
Yeah.
of people first. We teach people rather than teach players. We coach people rather than players. So all those topics that you hit upon there, that your books hit upon, and I've recommended your books for coaches who have young players and older players. So I'm really pleased you said it's not just for 5 to 10-year-olds and older players, adolescents, who might be experiencing some challenges in these biopsychosocial areas. So I was excited when you agreed to come on because I want to have a conversation today which isn't sport but is sport in so many
Yeah.
respects, isn't directly what is obvious about coaching, because coaching is so aligned with the technical, tactical and physical sides of football and basketball and
Mm.
cricket, etc. But the reality is the moment to moment, the session to session, the day to day demands of the role and the passion of the role does force us to coach people. Does that make, because I know we had a conversation before we came on air, and I know you're not necessarily an overt sports fan, but does that actually make sense to you that a sports coach would be a coach of a person first rather than, let's say, a sporting competitor?
Like 100%. And what's so interesting, even though I'm not a particular sports fan and I'm not sporty at all, I wish I was, but to me, there's something huge about so much of the work that I do is about that every interaction is an intervention, about how do we see the person behind the behavior. But also, so much of my thing is around how trauma or emotions are held in the body. You know, the Bessel van der Kolk, the body holds the score. Or I often say, if the body could talk, what would it say? And so much of the work I do is about the physical environment, the sensory, the tone of voice, and about having a life cheerleader, a life inspirer, someone who gets alongside you. So for me, often the most important person in someone's life is the person who is in the sports world, or is the person who's coaching someone or cheerleading them on. And then you integrate those regulating physical movements. And even though I don't do sports, I integrate a lot of movement and sensory activities on an organizational level and on an individual level. So yeah, absolutely. And it's about having that outlet. But yeah, it's the relationship, isn't it? Relational trauma requires relational repair. And so and if you've got a shared interest that you can be able to anchor on, amazing. I mean, if I've got someone who's into football, I could get a football and draw coping strategies on the different hexagons of the football, or different feelings or different people. So, and you could talk about who's your team of life and who scores the goal. So even though I'm not in that world, I completely honor and appreciate and get how they are utterly interlinked, really.
A couple of things you said there. Every interaction is an intervention, and we hold emotion, feelings in our body. It feels like those go hand in hand. When you're a coach, every word counts, every silence matters, every behavior you engage in possibly influences the emotions and feelings that the people in our care experience, and subsequently they hold those feelings and emotions in their body. Would I be hearing you right there?
Yeah, I think there's huge amounts. I think how I always say we're not people's final destination, but we leave a footprint or a heartprint. And it's kind of how we fill someone's memory bank or take their brain to the strengths gym or the relationship gym. So, and absolutely, when I say every interaction is an intervention, it can be positive or negative. It can be trauma inducing or trauma reducing. It can be restricting and constricting or enriching. It can open doors or close doors. And as you say, that could be a word, a facial expression, a movement, eye contact. So it's that Maya Angelou, people forget what they say, forget what you do, but remember how you make people feel. And absolutely how that gets encoded in our bodies, or how we take that as a different experience, can be huge. So yeah, lots around that.
There's a fairly prominent football manager called Brendan Rodgers, Karen, who I love what he said once. He said he imagines every player has an invisible tattoo on their forehead, and that invisible tattoo says, "Help me feel great." Help me feel great. Something to pick up on there. We become their memories. We become their memories. So the things that we see, they hold those things and they go on to, I'm thinking in coaching terms here, because as a coach, Karen, let's say you're a coach of 14-year-olds. Often those 14-year-olds would have had a different coach at 13 years old, a different coach at 12 years old, much like school, right? Much like school, different school teachers. And so as a coach, let's say I'm a coach of 14-year-old team, a bunch of 14-year-old players. Their behaviors have been influenced by the coaches that they've experienced previously, not just from a skills perspective, but also from an emotional perspective. Would I be right in sort of saying that?
Completely. We know it's those ghosts and angels of the past, but it's also, what we're trying to do is leave a sort of memory bank internally that people, it's that whole sort of invisible string idea, isn't it? That wherever you go, whatever you do, you might not physically be with that person, but emotionally they can be in your head, in your heart, in your feet, rooting or cheerleading you on. Or you might think, oh, what might Karen say at this time, or how would she make them feel? So you take those pieces of those people with you, but they also, each interaction teaches us how to do relationships, how to be in relationships, what to expect from relationships. They sort of give us those relational maps or relational templates that we then take on to our next one. So absolutely, it kind of is that imprint, that heartprint, really.
Alongside your collection of workbooks that I would recommend for any coach, coaching young people, you've written a book, a treasure box for creating trauma-informed organizations. And I suppose I say to the listeners out there, you might, some of you are actually coaching within an organization, a big, large, huge organization, for example, like a Manchester United or a Tottenham Hotspur or an Arsenal, or an organization like that. Equally, you might be within a smaller organization, a small team of you. I really believe this book is very, very relevant, no matter how broad the organization is around you. You started off as a clinical psychologist working, I suppose, with individuals or with families or in a clinical setting. But at some point, you shifted onto an interest in how the wider organizations or wider systems impact trauma. Can you give us a bit of a history as to where that shift came from? How comes you shifted your interest from the individual to the wider system and organization?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to say that in a concise way. And I guess it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's both and. I kind of love both, but
Yes.
absolutely my focus is now much more on system change. And I think that's because firstly, my training as a clinical psychologist actually was quite systemic by very nature.
Okay.
But then I worked in hospitals in the NHS. I worked in lots of different social care, local authorities, child welfare for Americans listening. I worked in prisons. I worked in cross-cultural settings. And what was so apparent to me is that you could be the most incredible practitioner or clinician, but if you were working in a system that was traumatized or traumatizing or oppressive, or you were working in a system that had, systems that there were so many barriers or that were adding harm or hurt, actually, as Sandy Bloom says, it's like throwing seeds on dry land. And so what I started to think about is, well, hold on, it's not just what I'm doing in the room, it's that whole sense of the environment. So Alexander Den Heijer says, if a flower doesn't bloom, you don't try and fix or change the flower, you change the environment in which it grows. And so for me, I was like, well, hold on, take social services as an example. It's not how I'm working individually with that child, albeit that's important. It's how we do recruitment. It's about our physical environment. It's the language that we use in our forms. It is about the buildings. It's about team meetings. It's about staff well-being. If we have staff who are exhausted, depleted, dissociated, shut down, crushed empathy, how are we going to be able to do those relationships? And so I started seeing how different I was depending on the team I worked in or the context I worked in. And so I started becoming more interested in systems and organizations and started working. I went and got a job around implementation science, which is a random job, but it's basically how do you take an intervention and extrapolate it? And I started getting really interested about how we take ideas across in different contexts. And that kind of led me to a Winston Churchill Fellowship, which I'll pause there for now.
Well, to know, please tell me about the Winston Churchill Fellowship. What is that, and where did that lead you?
So it's a phenomenal thing that I cannot recommend enough for anyone who's listening who is from the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So in essence, it is a fellowship that was started where you get a pot of money and you can go abroad to other countries to learn about best practice in a particular area and then bring that best practice back to inform, infuse and disseminate it in England. And so for me, I basically what was happening is this trauma-informed word was being used left, right, and centre on social media. People were popping it on websites. Everyone was saying we're trauma-informed, red flag. We're putting a fruit bowl in the reception. That means we're trauma-informed. We're going to pop it on a brochure. And whilst that was exciting that it was getting more recognition and hearing, I also was like, hold on a minute, this is something that could be transformative and it's being diluted and misused and overused. And so I wanted to go to America, which is what I did, to really learn about what do we mean by trauma informed at an organizational level, not on an intervention trauma specific level. And what are best practice? What are examples? What does that look like? What are some of the implementation barriers? What are some real world examples? And so I went to 14 different cities across the East and the West Coast and
Wow.
visited loads of organizations, from schools to prisons to child welfare, to all sorts around. And I met people who were doing it on the ground, and I met people who have been doing it for 20, 30 years, and the trailblazers, to really try and think about what are the values, what are the principles, what does this mean, how does it interweave with other things, and then to bring that back to support the organisations I work with here, really.
And I'd like to talk about trauma and trauma-informed organisations, but before I do, I would say that don't underestimate a fruit bowl in reception, though, Karen. That's in sport, we'd call that a marginal gain. A marginal game, a 1%, a tiny.
And I'm with you. I love the fruit bowl. I'm all for snacks and fruit bowls, but it's when people call themselves trauma informed because there's a fruit bowl and nothing else is there. But I'm with you. I love some snacks and a fruit bowl.
Yeah, you get to put trauma informed on your website just by putting that fruit bowl in reception. Clearly. Hey, look, you start the book by posing the question, what is trauma? And I'm conscious there's a difference between, someone's individual trauma and trauma-informed organisations, but it would be wonderful of you to start for the audience, for me, for us, in terms of what is trauma from an individual perspective as compared to what is a trauma-informed organisation. What's the difference between the two?
Yeah, and I suppose that there's so many nuances within that. So I'll say a couple of bits and see what lands.
Yeah.
So one of the big things that people get really confused about and tie into knots is the difference between trauma specific and trauma informed.
Okay.
And so trauma specific is if I am working with a child, for example, who's been in a car accident or been in war or experienced sexual abuse, and I am directly intervening or working or processing on their trauma using a trauma specific model like trauma focused CBT, or eye movement desensitization reprocessing, a specific thing, that's trauma specific.
Okay.
But trauma informed is I could be a police officer or a teacher or a lollipop person helping someone cross the streets, or I could be a security guard in an airport or a dentist who's trauma informed. What we're saying is we don't expect a dentist to be delving in and asking someone about their trauma, or the dinner person in the canteen at school. No one's saying you need to be a therapist or work or process on someone's trauma. But what we're saying is you can use the ideas and values and principles and knowledge of trauma to think about, how do I do my procedure in the dentist surgery differently? Or how do I set up the classroom or discipline a child differently? Or how do I, when I'm arresting someone, do it in a trauma reducing way instead of trauma inducing? So that's the bit that I think people get, that almost trauma informed means I need to know everything about trauma and I need to work on someone's trauma, as opposed to how someone does a search at an airport can either be trauma inducing or trauma reducing, how someone makes you feel. So that's one of the big differences with that. In terms of individual trauma, it's really hard because that in itself is an umbrella term when someone says individual. Because if I've experienced a single event like a car accident or a sexual assault as a one off, that's really different to as an individual experiencing complex, cumulative relational and developmental trauma or medical trauma or birth trauma or intergenerational. So each one, and then again, each person has their own meaning making or sense making. So I think it's a really kind of big area. But when we talk about it from an organizational level, we're talking about how an organization itself can become traumatized and traumatizing and can add to system trauma. But also we're talking about how can you look at the physical environment or how your staff well-being or the language you use or your policies or your processes or how you do your referral forms or your transitions and discharge. We're looking at the organizational fabric and taking the ideas of trauma about dissociation, survival modes, emotional regulation. You're taking the values like safety, trust, cultural humility, and you're infusing them into how you do team meetings, how you do reflective practice, those organizational aspects, in essence.
I'd like to unpack some of that. Some of that stuff around the fabric of the organization, just dwelling briefly on the nature of trauma. As you said, this is an umbrella term. I mean, in your opinion, if I was to say to you, look, I lost a job, and I feel that that was a traumatic experience. I failed my GCSEs. I feel that was a traumatic experience. Are those fair things to put under the umbrella of traumatic experience?
I think it's a really interesting question because we know it's become part of the language. I missed the bus, so I'm traumatized. That person said something to me, and so I'm traumatized. Are there certain definitions for trauma? Yes, but I come from the perspective of I have to honor that person's lived and living experience and the term that they choose. And so for me, if it's every person's meaning making, sense making, how they position it or how they make sense of it. So if someone is choosing to use that word, I might explore it, but I would honor and respect because I don't have an emotional x-ray and actually they're the expert of their own experience. And so to me, yes, might that be seen it in the DSM criteria or in a clinical setting? Maybe not, but absolutely. I think people need to feel validated, heard, acknowledged, and not minimized or trivialized. So, yes, I would go with whatever the person bought whilst exploring. Is it an adversity? Is it a stressor? Is it frustration? When you mean trauma, what does that mean or look like to you?
So it's quite, in many respects, it's quite phenomenological. It's in the eye of the beholder. It's what you personally experiencing. So if I'm a 12, 13-year-old kid and I have, even if I just have I love football. I'm a 12-year-old kid. I love football and I have a run of poor games and maybe I get shouted at. That if I determine that to be a traumatic experience, and I may not even use the word traumatic experience, but if I have a certain sensitivity to that, then that actually can be deemed a traumatic experience.
Yeah, for that person. And I think it's the same as let's use the football
Yeah.
example. If the kid goes up and says, "Hey, can I play football?" and the other kids say, "No, sorry, we don't need anyone. We've got enough people for today." One kid might be like, all right, cool, I'll just ask tomorrow. Another child might feel utterly excluded, rejected. And for all we know, they're going down a chain of pain, down a time hole to I'm rejected. And at home, they're feeling rejected or othered or not included. And so, whilst it might not be about playing the football or not playing the football, the feeling of feeling rejected or not good enough or not included can send them down a chain of pain or time hole and how they feel at that time. And it's not, we might help to put things in perspective, but equally, as they say, if we're not there for the small stuff, they don't come to us for the big stuff.
something when you were talking about trauma-informed organizations, as opposed to trauma-specific, essentially what you're saying is, because I'm mindful of the coaches listening in, you, the coach, you don't have to engage a young person, and you probably shouldn't engage a young person in some kind of therapeutic process. Trauma informed is, even at its least, it's being mindful of who is in front of you, the experiences they've had, and being mindful of the let's say the inner world that drives their outer world, their behaviors. Would
Yeah.
I be hearing you correctly there?
Absolutely. And it's the how. If you have that knowledge, it's the how you do what you do. So let's say, as a sports coach, and obviously I'm not a sports
No, no.
coach, but as a sports coach, if you were going to be like, right, everyone's going to do this activity, for example, it's not everyone's going to do the activity, it's how we explain and introduce the activity. It's knowing that we might need to give choice or an option to opt out or pass. It might be that that activity might be really fun for one person, or doing an award ceremony might be really fun for one person, and for another person might be triggering or dysregulating or feed into feeling I'm not good enough. So it's not saying you need to process the trauma, but it is, if you're going to do an activity, or even talking about when we shorten someone's name, that they might not want their name shortened, or to honor what they want to be called. So it's looking at what do we do on our day-to-day role as a sports coach from a trauma lens. Or if we, for example, see a kid that is shutting down or withdrawn, actually understanding the trauma lens might help us to be curious instead of furious, or tread gently. Or if we see a kid who finds it really difficult when they lose, actually understanding what losing might represent for them, or how it might send them down a time hole, or what their memory bank of other losses might be. So it's looking at your task, and even things like being in the changing rooms, what that might be like, being in a changing room if someone has difficulties with abuse, or their bodies, or their body image, or physics, or what eating might represent when we're telling them advice about healthy eating, what that might be like for someone who has had a difficult relationship to food or body image. So it's looking at your role from a trauma lens and using the values of trauma informed practice. So the knowledge of trauma and the values of trauma informed practice.
I know you can't necessarily speak for sports teams, but you consult with dozens, I think 90, you said, organizations in this area. I'm guessing I could take an educated guess that maybe sometimes you've had conversations maybe with leaders who have said, oh, wow, Karen, geez, I get this, but we've got so much to think about. I'm a leader of so many people, and how, I suppose, what kind of conversations have you had there when you get pushback here, when people just say, look, at the end of the day, I can't be accountable for everybody's experiences in a past life. We've got to get on and manufacture these goods. We've got to get on and produce this marketing project. I'm sure the listeners can relate that to sports team. We got to get on and win. We got to get on and develop these players. We're a football club. We've got to produce footballers. What's your response to leaders in organisations when you get that kind of, whether it's pushback or just query?
Goodness, so many things. I think a few bits. So firstly, the trauma-informed philosophical question is, it's not what is wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. And I would ponder that with the leaders that I was consulting to or supporting. So it's not why are they resisting or being hesitant, but what's happened to you? Let's be curious instead of furious. What is your behavior communicating? And I think so often it's about honoring. They've got every right to feel how they feel. It is exhausting. It is frustrating. They are juggling loads. So I think firstly, it's that sort of what Dan Hughes says, connection before correction. And actually, I often am like, let's talk about the myths. Let's name the elephant in the room. Let's honor and acknowledge them, name it to tame it, and then we can work backwards and talk about it. And I often try and see resistance instead of resistance as protection or caution or feeling uncertain, and feeling overwhelmed. And then it's for me about thinking, do you know what? Well-being leads to well-doing. Maybe we need to go back to the basics and think about, rather than this feeling like something extra that you have to do, what are the benefits? And that includes, we know that people are more healthy, happy, satisfied, will be more productive, there'll be less complaints, there'll be less you know, incidents. It helps with dynamics, it helps with morale, it helps with staff retention and cohesion. So actually, even though it might seem that it takes more time, and often it's not the I think sometimes it's naming people feeling under so much pressure. There's not an answer a lot of the time. Sometimes it's just being able to be with someone, or name that someone
Mm.
feels that they matter, they're heard. Um, and then often, people are able to um, keep to the task at hand. But if we don't do that stuff, and that's the other question, what happens if we don't do this stuff? Then often what we see is people who are burnt out or exhausted, or it spills and leaks out in other ways. And then people are like, oh, why is that person not turning up? Or why are they not? Whereas actually, it's easier to prevent fires than put them out. And I think that's the whole point of that. If we help our organizational immune system, it's going to buffer when stressors come along much, much more. Kennedy said the time to fix a roof is when it's sunny. And I think there's a huge thing. And we've seen that with the pandemic, by the way. The organizations that have put amazing stuff in place actually have weathered the pandemic beautifully. Whereas those that already were feeling fragmented and crystallized and traumatized, it just brought the issues like oil to water to the surface. So yeah, I'm going on a tangent, but hopefully
No, I love it. I love it, and it completely resonates. And I know it would resonate for everybody listening in. I'm interested in unpacking some of the specifics here of a trauma-informed organization. You've mentioned physical spaces,
Mhm.
materials, language, policies in your work with these corporations. What examples have you seen or worked on with corporations around these areas, this fabric? What kind of things have been put in place to become trauma informed, or better at being trauma informed?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because every organization, as we know, and I think this would fit very well, I imagine, from sports, has its own personality, climate, culture, rules, jokes, organizational history, organizational memory.
Yeah.
And so every sort of organization has its own microclimate that you kind of need to hold in mind and think. And there's those ghosts and angels of the past. So it's different for different organizations. And you often need to start with a bit of a, where are we? Where do we want to go? What does that look like? But I'll give you just like a really tangible example that I think probably would fit quite well with sports, but I'll use it for my child's welfare social services. Sometimes it's the smallest things that we're looking at that are so tangible, that seem silly, but actually are really crucial. So, for example, posters on the walls or signs on the walls. I love an inspirational quote. I have them all over my house. I've got them in my car. I am an inspirational sort of quote person. That said, we need to think about the ones that we choose, as an example, from a trauma lens. So I'll give you a really tangible example. If I walk in to a social service reception area and they've spent lovely money, it's with good intentions, but on the left hand side there's a beautiful laminated poster saying keep calm and carry on, and on the other side there's a bee with a bumblebee, happy. Now those have been put there with lovely intentions, and I'm sure some people will love them and they'll be fab, some people have them in their houses, and some people won't even notice them. But I want you to imagine, if the building could talk, what would it say from a trauma lens? So, for example, I come in, I was raped last night. Be happy, keep calm and carry on. I'm coming in and I'm going through finding out if I'm being made redundant and I don't know if I'm going to have food to put on the table and I'm going through a frictional divorce. Be happy, keep calm and carry on. My whole life have been told to man up, grow a pair, big boys don't cry, and suddenly someone's telling me it's okay to show vulnerability, it's okay to cry, and I look at the wall, be happy, keep calm and carry on, and so on.
Yes. Yes.
So sometimes it's looking at the minutiae of things from a trauma lens, that it's the tangible, small things that can make a difference. How one word, as you mentioned, can make a difference. But then the other thing is looking at things from a much wider. So there might be an organizational culture of silencing or racism or bullying, or there might be we are just going to do self-sacrifice instead of self-care, and there's this culture of just toughen up and have a thick skin, and then I need to go in and support and think about collective care, community care, organizational accountability, well-being. And well-being isn't just about putting mindfulness on or giving someone an exercise bike, although those might be wonderful. It's also about looking at maternity and paternity policies. Is there access to reflective practice and supervision? How are they debriefing? It's there's so many different aspects that I sort of work through depending on where an organization's at, I suppose. So that's an example of a tangible small thing, and then something much bigger, really.
Where do I go there? There's so many directions I can go, just because the posters, just starting with the posters, resonate, because being a sports psychologist and being blessed to work in elite sports, most buildings in elite sports are plastered in motivational posters, and it's I get why that is done. It's well-meaning, and I dare say at some point a player has looked at a poster and thought, oh yeah, that's quite motivational. I think I'll go to the gym now. I'll go back in the gym, or I'll do another set, or whatever. However, as you said, these wise words, or these words from some of our sporting greats, somewhat lack nuance and complexity. And they have to. They can't. They can't have a quote for every moment, I suppose. But a lot of them revolve around toughness, in inverted commas, mental toughness, mental strength. Which these are things. Okay, let's accept these are things. However one defines them, but there is a push, and a great push at the moment, for well-being and welfare and mental health in these organisations. So how do these align? How does affording more room for vulnerability, how does that align with our motivational posters?
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think there's beautiful ways of having those, but you do often need to think about from the worst case scenario and then sort of work backwards, because absolutely there needs to be a nuance. And strong is a classic one, isn't it? There's so often this thing about being strong, and that can be amazing and gorgeous, but also what strong means to one person will be utterly different to another person. It's about the meaning making and sense making, but also what we know is that words, that silly quote, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. How we know, for many people, words can wound or stick or pierce or go round like a broken record, especially if you've had a past experience where you've been called that, and therefore it sends you down a time hole or a chain of pain. And I think words do really matter. And I think there's a classic psychology study. I don't know if you studied this in sports psychology, but there's a classic study that many people will study that I think speaks to this so much, about the power of one single word, which is by Loftus and Palmer. And they basically got a group of people, random people, split them into two groups. And they said to one group, you're going to watch a video of a car accident and the cars bump into each other. And they got another group and they said, you're going to watch a video of a car accident and the cars smash into each other. Same exact room, same person, same video, same everything. One teeny tiny word difference, smashed versus bumped. And they then watched the video, they sent them home, and they called them back a week later and they said, did you see blood and broken glass? And how fast do you think the car was going? And as we know, those who had the word smashed were more likely to see blood and broken glass. The car was going 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. Those who had bumped, there was less blood and broken glass. The car was going 20, 30 miles per hour. There was no blood and broken glass. And the car was going, I think, at 27 miles per hour. Words stick. And that's thinking about when we use words like strong, lazy, attention seeking, manipulative, how these words might land or what they might mean is important to note in that way.
You actually didn't evoke memories of my sports psychology masters, but my first degree at Goldsmiths. You evoked the memory of the Goldsmiths library and Elizabeth Loftus, and
yeah. Oh, good. You remembered her first name. I'm impressed about that.
Elizabeth Loftus. Yeah, did lots of essays about her work. Great stuff on memory. And it's interesting, you know. Now I think about it as you were talking. Now I visited a I won't name the club, but a training ground of a very big football club. And actually, there was an absence, I would say, of motivational posters. But what there was were three words on the wall, blazoned on the wall, actually in the gym, very big gym. I think it was togetherness, preparation, and compete. And what I loved about this, and I said this to the person who gave me this tour. This person was sort of involved with the sports science and performance, so heavily invested in this area. I said, what I love about that, and to speak to what you're saying about the power of words, is that you can do so much with those three words throughout the fabric of the building, throughout across the language of the organization. Okay, togetherness, right. What are all of those mini processes, whether it's participative or something to do with learning or something to do with performance, what does that mean for us, and what are we going to put into our day-to-day language and our day-to-day processes around togetherness, preparation? Okay, what does that? So I completely agree. I love words because words evoke pictures and feelings and emotions, but they just also inform so many actions and behaviors and so many things around the building, right?
Yeah, it's huge. And I think I'm with you, something like togetherness. It's beautiful because you could do a whole, okay, what's a collage about that? What's a word cloud? How do we not just know it, but how do we infuse that into meaning? How do we know that? How can we keep a record of that? If togetherness could talk, what would it say? If you were going to think of a metaphor or a color or an image or whatever that might be, how do we bring it alive? And I think that's the beauty, where people are also able to take these things, but put their meaning making, their sense making, and then find a way individually and I guess as a team to make that fit, or to talk about the difference within that, which there might be as well.
Well, the robust nature of it, you can take togetherness, preparation, and compete, and they can stretch across performance, welfare, well-being, mental health, as you said, and even something like we could take compete, for instance, and actually what we now know is that competing, the capacity to compete, isn't just this one-dimensional a will to win, a will to perform in sport. Actually, thanks to our good mates Richard Ryan and Edward Deci in motivational theory and self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation, everybody is motivated in different ways, and not every sports competitor, even at the highest level, Karen, is necessarily motivated by winning. The motivation is much more flavoursome than just this one-dimensional approach. And then, as you said, with the preparation, that's where we could bring in vulnerability. That's where we can say, well, some of us prepare more effectively if we actually start to talk about the kind of things that are going to hold us back, the kind of ants, automatic negative thoughts we might experience when we're in the heat of battle, for instance. So out there on the pitch. So, as you say, expanding on words.
Yeah, and I think what you just did there, which you may or may not have noticed, is um, I think some of the answer of when we're dealing with a team or different people around mental health is you use the word some. And actually, that's the key in so much of it. What we often do with good intentions is we say, we all, or everyone, or I know exactly how you feel, or, we all have been stressed in the past 2 years, or everyone is desperate to get back to normal lives, or we use these sweeping statements that actually what that does is it fills into there is a good, a bad, a right, a wrong, a should, this toxic positivity, and it's us or them. You're either with us, and it doesn't leave for the nuance. And so, even things like when you're coaching, that whole sense of some people might feel such and such, and other people might feel like that. Same storm, different boat. That I wonder if, but I'm not sure. Some people in your shoes might feel really excited, and some people might feel worried, and some people might have a blend or a mix of all of those feelings. So I think a lot of it is with good intentions, we try and we're in this together, but actually it's enabling, if you want that vulnerability, it's allowing those spaces that we can have both and we can also be in a space where it's okay that I feel similar or different to that other person. And I think that in itself is huge. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Now, I'm conscious of your time, and I'm also conscious everybody listening in probably doesn't realise that you've been training 300 people today at the end of a long day. So your time has been so generous. I have two scenarios to finish us off with
Mm.
that I'd love to get your opinion. But hopefully, this isn't putting you fractionally on the spot, but. Let's go scenario one, scenario two. Scenario one, and what I'd love to hear is any kind of just, even if it's one little bit of advice for coaches. Lots of coaches listening in, and I'm always conscious that there's a divide here. We have sort of grassroots coaches listening in, Karen, who maybe get their hour and a half on a wet Wednesday night in Wigan, and that's all they get during the week, right? And with their players, with their people, and so the kind of stuff that we speak about on a sports psych show is can always be, admittedly, challenging for them to put into their own coaching practice and processes. So, scenario one, let's go with scenario one first. That coach who has an hour and a half with
Mm.
players, not much time, really very few resources. It's not their everyday job. They have their own family, they have another job of their own, so they're just coaching for fun because they want young people to experience the joy of playing sport. But just by pure statistics, we know that many of their players, their people, will come loaded with traumatic experiences. What is there any advice, anything that they can look out for, anything you feel that they should do in their own coaching behaviors or anything like that you could potentially recommend?
That is a hard question. So I suppose I'll go with what you said of just a golden nugget. So I think
Yeah,
for those people, it's that every interaction is an intervention. And to
yeah,
me, the
yeah,
best that they can do in that time is give that person the feeling of you are invested in, you're interested in, you matter, you're
yeah,
important. And actually, I believe in you and I'm rooting for you and I'm here for you.
yeah,
And I'm going to be really physically present and emotionally available in this hour. And that might be also knowing about your local context where you can support or be a bridge or signpost to. But in that hour and a half, I'm not going to be thinking about my dinner and I'm not going to be thinking about what's on TV. I'm going to give you an example of someone who cares, who is present, who is here, and that in itself is a huge thing. And if someone is seeming demotivated or getting upset or turning up late or whatever that might be, trying to be curious instead of furious and separating the problem from the person. It's not that they're a pain in the ass or they're lazy or they're awful or they're this. that it is the behavior that we might be focusing on, but fundamentally holding that that person is so much more. And just because we don't know what they're living through or experiencing, just by holding it in mind, I'm seeing a snapshot, not the full length. I'm seeing the tip of the iceberg just by being as curious as possible and not jumping to conclusions. That is huge. So I think us being regulated ourselves so that when we come, we are ready to give our all. I always say, how do we give people the best of us, not what's left of us? And I think that's a huge thing about when I'm there, if I've got an hour and a half, they deserve the best of me in that hour and a half. And giving an example of an adult or a person who can be a role model, who can say you're important, you're not a name on a piece of paper or something, but that you matter.
I love that, and not underestimating all of that, because I think it's easy to underestimate that, isn't it? My final question is scenario 2, which is the converse, which is I'm also conscious that we have coaches tuning in who are fortunate enough to be involved with very big sporting organizations, maybe coaching the superstars of global sport. Now, you're dealing with corporate environments, corporate organizations who are multi-million pound organizations. So it's a very, very similar. What would be, I mean, we've covered a lot, so feel free to sort of re-emphasize some of the things you said, but what would be a couple of nuggets there, one or two nuggets there for them?
So again, I would say we need to start with ourselves. I think it's
Yes.
really interesting that so often organisationally, we're very quick to comment on what other teams are doing or other organisations are doing. And we need to get our own ducks in a row. And so I think we need to model the model in many ways. So if we talk about what we want to see in other people, we need to be able to treat people how we want to teach them. We need to, and the same as, for example, a classic model the model in sports is as a manager or a leader, if we can't turn around and say, I cocked up or I made a mistake or I'm really sorry or I snapped or I overreact, how can we then expect for someone to be able to feel it's okay if we don't model the model? But I think a lot of that is about staff well-being and wellness, that actually as a big organization, if it's just a tick box, if it's just lip service, it's not meaningfully infused. And actually, if we invest in people and know that people are so much more than the sport and coming with all of those things, that in itself will have positive ripple effects.
Brilliant. Karen, that was awesome. That hour absolutely flew by.
It did.
And I know that you will have really tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. I can't recommend your books highly enough. Whether it's the workbooks, whether it's the trauma informed organization book, firstly, how can people get hold of that? I'm assuming it's going to be the normal channels. How can people find you? Have you got a website? And how can people follow you?
Yeah, completely. And there's also just the bit to add in about the cards, because I
Oh,
actually
yes.
think the
Yeah.
cards are an amazing tool for coaches to use. And they're much quicker and easier and more user friendly in many ways than having to read a book. So just to sort of
Just briefly, do you want to
mention
briefly
those.
tell us about that just in a couple of minutes?
Yeah, so I've got sort of five sets of
Mm,
cards. One of them would probably be less useful in a sports context, but the others would be super useful. I've got ones about strengths and self-esteem with loads of different positive activities, games, self-esteem building, which is huge.
brilliant.
I've got ones that are grounding, soothing, calming, regulating activities if someone's feeling stressed, anxious, overwhelmed. I've got ones to help people express their feelings, their wants, getting to know the person. I've got trauma specific ones, if anyone is. And then the other bit is more around kind of child development, the impact of trauma and attachment on developing children, which might be interesting to some people, but less sort of direct. So yeah, books, some resources, normal channels, Amazon, the publisher Jessica Kingsley, anywhere you'd normally buy books from. I do have a website which is www.safehandsthinkingminds.co.uk. I'm super active on Twitter as Dr Treisman, which is Treisman. And I've got a Facebook group, Safe Hands and Thinking Minds.
Brilliant. Fantastic. I can't thank you enough for your time, especially after your long day. So thanks so much, Dr. Karen Treisman. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.